So welcome everybody. We are just going to give everybody a minute to get settled as I keep letting people in. My name is Ann Polson. I'm the Associate Curator of Collections here at the Henry, and I am actually at the Henry, which is pretty exciting. We're still not open to visitors, but we hope to be. I think right now we're hoping that things will be a little bit more open in the Seattle campus in September, October. So if you are interested in coming to see us, pencil those dates in your calendar. Before then, it's just me, but I'm glad to be here with the pieces that I pulled for today's program. And we're going to talk with Julia Harrison about them in a moment. But while everyone's getting in, I just want to start by saying that we at the Henry Art Gallery and the University of Washington live and work on the unceded ancestral lands of the Coast Salish peoples and the shared waters of all tribes and bands, named and unnamed, including Suquamish, Duwamish, Tulalip, and Muckleshoot nations. The land acknowledgement reminds us of our connections and indebtedness to the peoples and the more than human kin where we live and work. As we spend this time together, we pay respects to elders past and present. So thank you for joining us. And this is one of the iterations of our Unpacking Form and Function program, in which we focus on decorative and design arts that are in our collection. And we have different people with professional and personal interests speak to the items that they have selected as being most pertinent to their work. And so today we have Julia Harrison, who's going to speak about some of our jewelry. I do have the jewelry out here as well. So if you have questions and want to see different close-ups or backs or fronts or whatever, you can just let me know. But right now I'm going to turn it over to Julia.
Thank you, Anne, and thank you everybody who has joined us today. I am delighted to be here, and I was really pleased and actually kind of emotional about getting this invitation after living in Seattle for almost 20 years and earning my MFA at the University of Washington. I moved to North Carolina in November, so I'm talking to you now from basically a mountaintop in Western North Carolina, and I'm still kind of homesick for Seattle, so this is a really special thing for me to get to kind of reacquaint myself with the Henry. So thank you very much. Okay, I'm going to start sharing my screen and my presentation. Let's see. Okay, so Anne, are we seeing the first page of my presentation now?
Yes.
Okay, fantastic. As I explained, this was kind of an emotional invitation for me. And another aspect of that was when I started looking through the Henry's collections online, one of the first things I spotted were these two pairs of earrings. And these are actually examples of a technique that I did a research project on about 25 years ago. And oddly enough, thanks to like the weird, you know how when you move, things kind of either disappear forever or resurface out of the mists of time. I had actually found this research paper and read it again recently. So again, it was like a really wonderful chance to be reacquainted with these. So I'm glad that Anne has said that we actually have the pieces accessible to us right now so that we can take a look at them maybe during the question and answer section. Because I'm really aware of the fact that their visual impact does not translate terribly well in these two-dimensional, you know, what you might think of as like a museum mugshot, right? Jewelry never looks very good in these conditions, and especially not this kind of jewelry. So what you need to imagine that is that in real life, this blue color that's kind of washed out in these photos would be bright, iridescent, almost an eye-watering blue, something that you would have a lot of trouble kind of looking away from or not noticing if somebody walked into a room wearing one of these pairs of earrings. The Henry's earrings are definitely pretty modern and were, I would say, probably made with the tourist or export market in mind. But they're examples of an art form that has been practiced in China for well over 1,000 years and probably closer to 2,000 years. And this is a technique that in Chinese is called Tian Sui, which translates most literally as dotting, D-O-T-T-I-N-G, with kingfisher, so little touches of kingfisher. And in English, we've used a variety of different terms for this technique over time, things like kingfisher inlay, kingfisher work, feather work, but the expression that is used most commonly is kingfisher enameling. The kingfisher part of that term is 100% literal. So every tiny little bit of electric blue that you're seeing in the images of this work is a tiny little swatch that is cut out of a real bird's feather. There are a couple of different types of kingfishers that are used for this work, but in either case, only a relatively small number of an individual bird's feathers are the appropriate shade of iridescent blue. And of these, an even smaller percentage are the right size or texture to be used in the kingfisher enameling work. And that texture is actually kind of an important thing. And I believe that's probably one of the reasons why in English we use the expression enamel for this, because even though these are feathers and there's sort of a fibrous and striated surface on them, when you choose the right type of feathers and you do a very good job of cutting them and adhering them to the piece, it gives it a very glassy, almost vitreous appearance. It's incredibly smooth and reflective. The other reason that we use the term enameling probably has a lot to do with the parts of this piece that you're not quite as aware of, and that's the substrate. So this is usually made out of metal sheet that was most typically silver. In some cases, that silver was left as is, and in other cases, it was gilded, and that would depend very much on the prevailing fashions of the day or who the pieces were being made for. So that thin sheet is made a little bit stronger, usually by doming it gently. So there's a slight convexity to these things. And then the designs are pierced or sliced out, and they're generally outlined with little raised wires. As you could see in the previous image, those wires are often actually have this kind of light capturing quality to them. So this whole structure, the way these things are put together, is very similar to the process of making cloisonné enamel, in which all of these little cells, these little walled off design areas, would be filled with the vitreous enamel, which would then be baked and melted and hardened in place. So just instead of enamel, they're using the kingfisher feather in these cases. So for most of the history of this technique, it was practiced in the workshops of China's imperial palaces. And that was also the market where most of this work would have been used and worn and given. So it was not something that generally appeared outside those walls. Inside the workshops, they were able to achieve great heights with this technique, in part because they would split up the production among various specialists. So you might have somebody who was doing the design work, somebody who was doing perhaps the metal piercing and forming, somebody else who was soldering on all those tiny little wires. And then finally, there would be the person who would handle the feather, which is actually a pretty tricky job. It was probably not unlike putting on gold leaf. So you have these little bits of things that if you breathe on them the wrong way are just going to go everywhere and scatter to the winds. So these little pieces would be adhered using tools like these that were collected by the Pitt Rivers Museum in the late 1890s. And you can also see in the middle an example of one of the pieces prior to the application of feathers. So what this production line method did was it allowed these workshops to produce, on the one hand, work of incredible quality. So I'll show you some examples of work that is just kind of mind-boggling in how fine and detailed it is. And then there's also other periods of time in this long history of this technique where the emphasis was more on volume. And so they were pumping out dozens, sometimes hundreds of pieces for a particular event. And the quality is definitely a little lesser, but that was one of the ways that this production technique could respond to whatever the demands of the day might have been. Although those little wire walls do offer these incredibly fragile little bits of feather, some protection from abrasion, it was still considered most suitable to use the Kingfisher enameling technique for examples of adornment that would not get a lot of abrasion or direct contact. So there are actually archaeological examples that survive and some fairly ancient examples as well. And these almost uniformly tend to be things that were worn on the head or in the hair. So they would not have been handled beyond the point when they were actually put on, when the person put them on. So here what you're seeing is an example of a crown. And just like I was saying earlier, the fact that like still photos don't really do this material justice. I would say that if you weren't aware of the fact that these were meant to be iridescent feathers on this crown, you might just look past it and think they were, you know, bright blue paint or maybe lapis or maybe some other kind of flat vitreous enamel. But once you start noticing this color and reading it as Kingfisher, you start to see it in all sorts of Chinese art, and particularly in depictions of the royal families and emperors and empresses. So this right here is an example of a type of crown that was called the Phoenix crown. And in this image, it is shown on a dowager empress of the 7th century, although the painting was done a couple of hundred years later. And what you start to see over time is this style of crown, not just changing in response to new design influences, but also gradually diffusing down. So it became a thing that was very popular among non-royalty for special occasions, and in particular for weddings. This is one of those examples that I mentioned earlier that I think is just phenomenal, out of this world. I look at this thing and I can't even imagine the skill it took and the time it took to produce it. This is another example of one of the Phoenix crowns. And another thing that I really like about this image and why I wanted to include it is it starts to give you a little more of an understanding, hopefully, of just how eye-catching and attention-drawing this color would have been. And particularly in the environs of the Imperial Palace, there was a lot of this color used. And so I think that it created a very like saturated color palette. So one of the descriptions of those interiors that I found in an art history book talked about these imperial bedchambers where the ceilings and the floors were entirely covered in vermilion lacquer. The bedspreads and the curtains were all made out of Kingfisher feathers. And then in walk these stunningly beautiful women with dark hair and these electric blue ornaments. And really it just must have been kind of a sensory overload experience. This is obviously a very modern image, but this is a recent soap opera from China that has taken a lot of trouble with the attention to detail of the period costumes. This is a period drama that was set in the mid-18th century. And I mentioned earlier that because of the friability of these feathers, they were really suitable for things like crowns, diadems, earrings, and hairpins. And what you're seeing in this image right here is somebody wearing them all at once. And so you again start to get a little more understanding of kind of the experience that you might have of seeing somebody wearing these pieces. Another thing that is really tremendous about the architecture of these individual works is that they are often mounted in what's called en tremblant fashion, which means that a lot of the individual pieces would have been soldered onto either tiny little wires or actually little springs. And so not only is this thing brightly colored, not only is it iridescent, but as the woman wearing it moves, it actually moves with her and sort of jiggles. So just the sense of electricity that's conveyed by these pieces is magical. So during the Qing dynasties from roughly 1640s to 1912, this process of trickling down of this technique and these objects really picked up a lot of steam, and it certainly trickled down within China. With you start to see like cheaper, quicker versions of earlier imperial pieces being worn by, as I mentioned earlier, brides, also people getting dressed for special occasions. Within the palace itself, this starts to pick up, and there's more production. So as I referenced earlier, sometimes that was the choice, was to use this production line to just crank stuff out. So I read a description of a party in 1725 for which the Imperial Palace workshops rapidly made 184 pairs of hairpins, which probably helps to explain why things like hairpins are one of the main survivors that you'll see if you look for this work in the antiques market. The Victorians in England also loved jewelry that had a hint of the exotic, had particularly organic elements in it. And so this was something that was very popular when it began to be exported into England and also some other parts of Europe. And in 1865, there was an English jeweler who actually had, I think, kind of the effrontery to patent a process for adhering feathers to jewelry that was almost entirely derived from this Chinese process. And in the 1920s, the port of Shanghai started to do a thriving business in exporting these pieces to the flapper market, particularly in the United States. Also, you start to see all of these items getting kind of smaller and smaller and smaller. So from crowns to hairpins to earrings to even things like buttons. And then this is something that eventually died out around the start of World War II. And as far as I know, there are only a few people doing things like this still, using some special types of feathers and also doing reproduction or repair work. I do not believe that there's any actually like commercial industry in this production currently. So I will say, I'm going to start talking about my own work a little bit, and I just want to say, first of all, that I would not go out on a limb and claim that I have had any sort of direct influence from this technique from Tien Tsui. But where I started to think about this was, if you put a piece of my work and a piece of Tien Tsui at a dinner table together, like what would they find to talk about? And I think that there are actually quite a few things on which these two techniques or approaches find common ground, or at least places where they disagree in an interesting fashion. Then I think the number one thing here is certainly color. So I tend to use a lot of materials like wood and metal and stone in their natural state and leave them in their natural color. But I'm certainly fascinated and really strongly attracted to this color blue, and I will use it any excuse I can. So this is an example of a wire work piece that I made a while ago that is covered with powder coating that has this kind of iridescent blue effect to it. So part of what I really love about this color is that it's quite unusual, and because of that, I think it attracts your attention. And a lot of the work that Tien Tsui did, and a lot of the work that my own, particularly my jewelry work does, is about attracting attention and directing it to certain places. And if you think about it, in the imperial courts in China, it's pretty bald. This idea that during those times, women did not have any intrinsic power. And so their ability to achieve any sort of security or stability was very, very strongly tied to their ability to attract the attention and patronage of a more powerful man. And so that was the role that this jewelry, this Tien Tsui, and its ability to attract attention served for more than 1,000 years. And in my own work, I'm certainly not doing that with any electric blue or whatever, but I am definitely directing attention, kind of pointing at different things, and certainly raising some questions about the performative aspects of being a woman. Another thing that I find really interesting about the kingfisher and also many other materials, is that they're so strongly imbued with a sense of a particular place or a particular culture. And I think that you can really spot this when you start to look at what is used for making souvenirs or tourist trinkets. So you're going to, if you want to make something that appeals to that market, you're going to really choose something that has that punch you in the face sense of place. Around the same time that exotic bits of kingfisher enameling began to be popular with non-Chinese consumers, you also started to see in the commercial jewelry world, the costume jewelry world, the use of blue morpho butterfly wings. These were also used for costume jewelry, and it was also primarily for export audiences. And this is something, this practice has had actually a very, very strong and very direct influence on a lot of my own work. And this is probably the most literal one of these pieces that I have ever attempted to make. And it's something that, again, as I struggle with my feelings of homesickness after moving away from Seattle, this is a piece I look at a lot. And this was the view of the Magnolia Bridge from the apartment that I lived in for the last 10 or 11 years. And the blue part in this is made just like it would have been in that jewelry from the 19 teens and 20s out of a little sheet cut from a blue morpho butterfly wing. And again, it's that iridescent blue color that I love and find really exciting. And part of what is so fascinating to me about this color, and also the color of the kingfisher feathers, is that they are not pigment-based colors. These are actually examples of what is called a structural or an interference color. So the color that we perceive is not really there. It is an illusion that's generated by different structures inside this material. So in the case of the feathers, there are actually little air sacs within the keratin of the feather that diffract the light in a way that gives us the impression of blue, which I find, especially in pieces that are about place, quite interesting to think about. Again, not colorful, but this is a piece that I think is strongly influenced by my interest in iridescence and as it ties to butterfly wings and the feathers. So iridescence is the ability of a material to be two colors at the same time. And it's a color that is experienced as much as it is seen, because the appearance of it is so transient and it's changeable, it's fickle. So depending on where you're seeing it from, you're going to get a slightly different experience. I mentioned earlier that entrant blanc, that kind of wibbly mounting that they used to use for the kingfishers that would really highlight this effect. And I have been exploring a similar kind of effect. You might almost think of this as being like a monochrome iridescence. I'm using strips of extremely reflective metal and forming it into these kind of cookie cutter shapes. And depending on how the lighting affects them, also depending on where the viewer looks at them from, the piece can look entirely different, and you can read or fail to read or misread different shapes from it. So I find that idea really interesting, the way your perception of the piece is almost entirely a function of your perspective on it. Perhaps because we human beings are such fragile creatures, we, I think, tend to put durability and longevity on kind of a pedestal, right? So especially when we talk about things like art. So there's this expression, life is short, art is long. In the jewelry world, it gets even more specific. Think about that juggernaut of marketing, diamonds are forever. But there's many organic and biological materials that are a really strong part of our everyday lives. And they're very vulnerable to time and wear. And so therefore they have this ability to kind of challenge our notions of what constitutes an appropriate material for art or for jewelry. And I certainly think that kingfisher enameling raises a lot of those questions. For me, I have gotten more and more interested in using these fragile materials. This example here is some cottonwood bark that I have been using to carve portraits of dead leaves. And this material is so fragile that sometimes it falls apart in my hands as I'm working with it. And this, to me, really evokes a powerful sense, a poignant sense of the passage of time. And especially, although, sorry, this isn't an example of it, but I love to see this in jewelry. The fact is that in jewelry, wear both activates the piece, it's the reason the piece exists, but because it gets worn, it gets wear and tear. So you start to see things, the more beloved a piece of jewelry is, often the more damage is done to it. Just thinking about like when you see someone who's wearing a wedding ring that's almost worn through in the back, how just incredibly powerful a symbol that is. And jewelry, just like that wedding ring, is often about both value and values. So by that, I mean worth, rarity, price tag. With a wedding ring, you know, that idea that it should cost X months of your salary or blah, blah, blah. But also about values in that it reflects what we believe in, what we think is beautiful. Who gets to wear things reflects who we think of as being worthy. And often jewelry is speaking about both value and values at the same time, which is a really fascinating tightrope. So in the case of Kingfisher jewelry, Tiansui subverted the usual systems of value for a long time. It was not part of the commercial market. And at that time, much of the jewelry in China was heavy and chunky. And although it might be beautiful, one of its primary functions was actually to act like a portable bank that you could melt down if you really needed to. And Tiansui kind of skirted around all of that. It was flimsy. It was an investment in time and labor rather than in the raw materials that you could then melt and to turn into something else. And that's a quality that I think a lot of my work really shares. So I've been making jewelry for a really long time, and I do work some in precious materials like metals and gemstones, but by far most of my work is made with materials that could not be melted, could not be repurposed. Although I guess you could burn them if you were really cold, and I have burnt pieces that didn't succeed sometimes. So I guess there are some possibilities down the road for them, but. This was something that I've, had to really ask answer a lot of questions and justify in my own mind when I started trying to sell my work. People who were used to thinking about things in terms of their gold weight or the value of the stones had a little more difficulty in understanding the value of something that was made out of, a piece of trash that I found on the road or a piece of wood that was from the burn pile. But going back to Tiansui, one of the things that then happened was that it became so popular that this idea of the raw material just being something that was kind of a found object completely turned on its head. And that raw material became not only a commodity, but also a very scarce and valuable one. At one point, China had so depleted its own kingfisher population that it had to turn to Cambodia. And there was this thriving market in importing kingfisher feathers. It was one of the primary exports from Cambodia during the Khmer period. And some of the things I've read have suggested that actually the temples of Angkor Wat may have been financed in large part by this trade. So finally, I would just like to say that for me, Tiansui is a technique that is both inspiring and also cautionary. So as an artist, my familiarity with this technique definitely led me to be more open to the idea of art as an experience. And although I love craft and I love materials, I definitely have kind of backed off from fetishizing objects quite as much as I might have before. And I'm much more interested in the impact that my work has on the people who see it and also on the world around me. So this is one of my recent pieces, and this is made entirely out of scrap metal that I, in some cases, dug up from a scrap metal yard where the stuff is kind of like buried in mud. And so it's a material that I'm kind of reclaiming from the waste stream, but it can also easily go back into the waste stream if it needs to. So I'm thinking more carefully about the cradle to grave aspect of the things that I make. And then as a consumer, as a person who, loves stuff, loves jewelry, loves pretty things, Tiansui is also a really powerful reminder to me of how badly a popularity can go wrong. So whether we're talking about kingfisher feathers or gold or sugar or echinacea or iPhones, when a whole bunch of us want the same thing, the cumulative effect of those hungers can be absolutely devastating for the people, the animals, the ecologies that are further down the supply chain than we are. So Tiansui definitely reminds me that I have to be really relentless. When I want something, I have to always ask myself and examine myself to make sure that I am going for the things that I myself really genuinely want, and that I'm being honest with myself about how much of these resources I really need. All right, well, that is the end of my presentation. I'm delighted to answer some questions, so I will stop sharing my screen in just a second. But I just want to say thank you again for being here, whether you're live or you're watching this later. And thank you to the Henry for inviting me. If you have any questions or you are interested in the kind of work that I do, please reach out through my website. There's also a sign up on my website for my monthly newsletter, in which I kind of go into some details about my own work. I also talk about some professional development topics, and also some of the aspects of kind of the creative process that I touched on a little bit today. So again, thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Julia. That was absolutely wonderful. And I am so excited I just didn't know very much about these pieces or this technique at all. And so I learned a lot, and I'm really excited now to know this. And it was really wonderful also to see your work and how that was in a conversation with this kind of process. So thank you so much. I'd like to open it to just invite anybody to ask questions. You can raise your hand, you can just unmute yourself, you can put it in the chat, whatever you like. Go ahead. Yes, Helena, please.
Oh, thank you. Thanks for sharing all the marvelous picture and the background. I actually come from China, so I it's pretty much a good reminder of what a rich culture back then I have. I have a question about, so basically all the jewelry design. What does this? Oh, are you thinking about the market, or are you thinking about the client? Like of course, all the jewelry design or something, you always have an audience in your mind. I was just wondering, when you trying to craft a project or something, like, what's your core value? Like, what guides you through, to make those decision making? If that makes sense.
Yeah, that does. Yes. Thank you for that question. That is, that's something that honestly, I kind of struggle with, and I sort of ask myself those questions, every day, because, it's not, I talked in this presentation a little bit about resource use, but another resource is just my life and my time. And so I think really carefully, although I don't always make the right choices, about what is important and what my goals are. So when I'm designing jewelry, I pretty much experience the full range of what you just talked about. So sometimes I am, I'm working for a client. And so I have to make something that's like gonna really fit their needs. And that's, one type of work. And then all the way on the other end, there's sometimes when I just want to express myself and I don't care if anybody else agrees with it or responds to it. So like for example, one of my favorite pieces was a ring that I made a number of years ago. God, like probably almost 15 years ago now. That is, it's a pair of hands that are kind of held up like this. And so you can wear the ring like as if you were offering or as if you were taking. And I made that at a time when I was just feeling really, really unhappy and disconnected. And so that process of making that piece allowed me to think through some things that were really painful, but also really, really necessary for me to think about to move forward in a happier and healthier way. And then what I really love about jewelry is that I can then wear that thing and then it reminds me of that process and all of those things that I learned. And then I can wear it outside my house. So when I go out into the world, I can actually have conversations with people or connect with people over this piece that I might not have had before. So, for me, that's what's really exciting about jewelry as a field. And it's that as I mentioned in this talk, that it's this idea that jewelry is about value and it's about values. And when you are wearing something, you are communicating. You might be saying like, I am married, or I'm a Christian if you're wearing a cross. So your jewelry is speaking for you, and in that way, it can become a bridge between you and other people. And when you're making that jewelry, you get that extra ability to actually design that bridge and choose what you're expressing. So that is what I'm always going for. And like that's kind of whether I'm working with a client and they want something in particular, or whether I'm making things that are like, there's this thing in jewelry called a production line, and that's when you make things that are maybe multiples, they're a little bit lower priced, and there's usually enough of them that like several people could buy them, right? So whether I'm doing that or I'm making something that's just one of a kind and might never leave my house or go to an exhibition or whatever, I am always trying to make a piece that is a bridge between one person and other people.
Oh, lovely, Julia. Thanks for sharing. May I follow up with one more question? If there are other people raise a hand, go ahead. I just don't say. I can
It's
wait.
all you. Go ahead.
Oh, okay. So I actually have a question about the most natural material you ever use. Like for now, there's a like trend. People are saying, "Oh, have those like recycled material to make jewelry." Or kind of that stuff, or you more on the design part, like you are mentioned about you want to have that bridge, that conversation with the potential client or the audience. But I'm just wondering, like, how you like? Do you think have you ever used plants to make jewelry, or like more sustainable material to make jewelry? Or like, what's your thoughts on those? Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah. One of my favorite materials to work with, I haven't used it in a while, but I really love it, is bamboo. And bamboo is one of those plants that's actually kind of it's doing good, right? It's creating oxygen, and it's helping to clean water depending on where it's planted. And it is amazing to work with. So I do a lot of carving. That's my absolute favorite way of working with materials. And bamboo is just a totally gorgeous material to carve. And then it is really durable. So it seems like it would be, pretty fragile, but I did this whole series of carved bamboo rings from actually the craft school that I live at now. I was here as a student a long time ago and I made these rings. And then I like gave them away outside of the dining hall one time. I put them out on a wall and let people take them, which is another great thing about working with materials that are found. You at least I feel like I can be a lot more free with just sharing them with whoever's interested in. And so I still run into people sometimes who have one of those rings from a long time ago. And there's definitely some people who are like, I washed my hands wearing my ring too many times and it cracked. But there's other people who have those rings, and when I first made them, they were that beautiful bamboo green. And over time, as they've dried, they turn this amazing golden color. And I find that, again, just like as somebody kind of resists using actual gold, but loves the color, the fact that I could just go and harvest like one stalk of bamboo and make 30 or 40 like gold rings out of it is kind of exciting. But yeah, I'm always looking for new types of material to use, and also always looking at other people who do that. There's so many jewelers, as you mentioned, right now, who are using a wide variety of organic materials, textile materials. Somebody that if you're into this kind of thing, you might check out. There's a jeweler who's from Finland originally, but lives in France now. And her name is Terhi Tolvanen. It's Terhi, and then the last name is Tolvanen. And she uses materials, like all different types of materials, with a fluency that is incredible to me. I just think her work is so beautiful. But you also see it, in plenty of other types of jewelry from different cultures and different points in time. I think we right now, the kind of mainstream consumer and jewelry world has really funneled down into only being interested in a few types of material. But if you look beyond that, there's definitely a lot of exploration and a lot of play going on.
Thank you so much for for the expanding. And I'm looking up on the jewelry you just referred to. Thank you.
Oh, good. Yay. Yeah, she's amazing.
Okay, cool.
Well, while we have a minute, I think, let's see. Start this and then switch that, and then just,
Oh yeah.
come on. See if this can.
I'm definitely gonna go play with these next time I'm in Seattle.
May I ask a question here?
Sure.
Please.
You talked earlier about working, I think it was with cottonwood bark.
Yes.
Was it the fragile material? Could you talk a little bit about what that is and what it's like to work with?
Sure. I mean, it is not entirely dissimilar to carving in wood, but the fibers that bind the layers together are not nearly as strong as they are in wood. And so the material, like, I mean, I'm sure you've seen cottonwood trees, like they're pretty widespread. The bark builds up layers on itself, and then eventually it can no longer adhere to the tree, and so it just sort of peels off. So you can just go around and collect it from the bases of the tree. And it tends to have a lot of sort of valleys in it. It's one of those trees that looks like it's been like raked by claws or something. So when I'm using it, I'm having to work around all of that. And one of the things that I have learned, and again, that jeweler that I just mentioned, Terry Tolden, has had a huge influence on me. And one of the reasons was that I read an interview with her years and years ago when I was really trying to be more of a normal jeweler. And there's in fine jewelry especially, there's this anti-glue policy, right? Like you don't glue anything together. But Terry was talking about how her knowledge of adhesives was crucial for doing the work that she did, and how she really took a lot of pride in it. And she actually referred to herself as a gluesmith. And that has become increasingly important to me, especially in this last year. So with carving the cottonwood bark, when it starts to come apart, I actually have to stick it back together with super glue sometimes. And I've also been carving amber lately. I was able to go just before the pandemic happened. I had taken a group of jewelry students to Mexico, and we were studying with an amber carving master there. And because amber is, again, it's a gem, but it's just this organic natural material that happened to fossilize. And it is always, I mean, with the exception of like some really amazing examples, it usually has a lot of like cracks and fissures and things in it. And so these master amber carvers were also using basically a type of super glue to make sure that things didn't fall apart. So that's kind of like, I don't mean to say that it's like a dirty secret or anything like that, but it is really interesting. It's just like when you have, when you've got our dog died a few years ago, and like as he was declining and becoming more fragile, the things that we had to do for him were changed. And so you had to really be aware of and perceptive about his needs. And it's like that when you work with fragile material. You can't just, it's not a sheet of metal that you can, you can saw it, you can hammer it. You have to be looking at it all the time, because every little part of it is different. Every piece of that material is different. And you just have to have this much more individual relationship with the material. So that's one of the things that's really fun about the cottonwood bark. And I'm working on a series that will all be those the dead leaves, and so my hope is to eventually have what will be like a pile of dead leaves that are all carved out of that material.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
All right, well, we just have another minute or two. If anybody else has a question or wants to see something up close, just let us know.
I would actually love it if you would wave those around closer to the camera. I'm really curious.
Yeah, so I think this one's particularly interesting, and what didn't show up in the images is that there's actually a pretty good amount of space between the two layers.
Yeah. So cool.
See a little bit about that. And then
it's really interesting that they're gilded as well, because that was not necessarily common. Yeah, look at that.
you can see it change color a little bit as we move it around.
Yeah, those are gorgeous.
And then of course, each one is different. You can see this one has the variation.
And are those like screw-on earrings?
Yes. You can see.
Okay.
Yeah.
Cool.
Both pairs are.
Miserably uncomfortable.
I cannot imagine wearing those for more than a few minutes at a time. That's got to hurt.
Terrible.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, if that is it, I think I see something. Oh, just a question about, are there any workshops in Seattle that can be attended? Do you know? I'm not aware.
Oh, for Kingfisher and Amlin specifically, or for just jewelry stuff? I'm gonna assume just jewelry stuff. So, yes, if that is the case, there is Danica Design, which is on University Way, like north of the university. Has jewelry classes. There's also Pratt Fine Art Center, which is down in the International or Central District on 23rd and Jackson. And then there's probably a few other places like that. I think some of the community colleges, or sorry, former community colleges, have some classes that you can take as well.
I see. Sorry, and thanks for the sharing. I have one last question about like doing your like conceptual design. Are you always doing sketch first, or just grab some materials, do it? Like
I do both, and sometimes depending on what I'm making, I make 3-dimensional sketches. So
Oh.
instead of, I'm not actually very comfortable with doing 2-dimensional drawings. Like I just, they almost never turn out like I want them to. So I have a whole bunch of different kinds of like modeling materials, like different kinds of clay and things that I will make things that I can look at. So 3-dimensional sketches.
Oh, lovely. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Great. Well, thank you again, Julia. This was absolutely wonderful. And
Yay.
we're so glad that you were able to spend this time with us, even though you are no longer here in Seattle. And of course, we hope that you and everybody else who's attending or watching can come visit us here at the Henry as soon as we're open. And so we'd also like to thank Arts Fund and the Gwendolyn Carkeefe Plus Chef Decorative and Design Arts Fund for making this program possible. And we're taking next week off, but on Thursday, August 12th, Professor Ben Schmidt is going to talk about a ceramic vase from China that it dates to about 1600. So I hope that anybody who's interested will join us then, and feel free to let everybody else know. So thank you again so much for coming. And Julia, it was lovely to have you, and hope you enjoy the rest of your day.
Yes, I enjoyed it very much. Thanks everybody, and have a good weekend.